Hi, and welcome to another special webinar with myself, Danny from Captivate FM, on how to launch your podcast successfully. Today, we'll be going through the 3 steps that will really help you launch your webinar. We're on a webinar that will really help you launch your podcast, as well as give you a nice free resource to walk you through that after the webinar's finished. And we'll put a link to that down at the bottom when the webinars are getting towards the end of the webinar. A little bit about myself. I'm Danny. I'm the head of podcaster experience and support at Captivate FM, and Captivate FM is leading or one of the world's only growth-oriented podcast host, and we help you distribute your podcast, launch your podcast, get it all out to the apps, manage it afterwards, tracking analytics, and all sorts of good stuff. And we have lots of cool tools to help you grow your podcast. And for myself, I've been podcasting probably since 2010 now, on and off. I'd had an old podcast way back in 2010. Really locked into doing podcasting and concentrating on podcasting probably since about 2016, 2017. And I've been with the Captivate team for about 18 months now. It's an awesome platform. I was a very happy customer before joining the Captivate team, and we always look forward to doing webinars like this to help you, get your podcast launched, regardless of what host you're with. These are really to help you launch your podcast. And obviously, we'd love to have you on Captivate FM. But if you're with another host at the moment and you're looking to launch, this webinar's for you. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. There are live comments, obviously, on the side of the YouTube channel if you're watching it on YouTube now. So if you've got any questions, my colleague Ben from Captivate even, will be taking the questions for you and dropping them into a Google Doc ready for answering at the end of the webinar. So if you've got a question, just put question at the front of whatever you want to ask, drop it in the comments, and Ben will pick it up for you and drop it into the Google Doc. And then we can obviously, pick that up and answer it for you at the end of the webinar. A little bit of housekeeping. As mentioned, if you've got a question, drop it in the comments. If there's anything that might pop up during the webinar itself that you're curious about, either drop it in the comments or we can follow up with that later. You can follow me on Twitter at DannyBrownCA. You can follow Captivate at Captivate Audio. And any questions about Captivate or launching a podcast or follow-ups to this webinar, just check in and ask over there, and we're happy to talk anytime. Now, as mentioned, we've got with the webinar, we've got 3 phases that we're going to cover today, which is pre-launch, pre-publish, pre-launch, and then post-launch. And that will really get you up to speed with some of the stuff that you need to do before you actually launch your podcast. It's all in the prepping stage and the planning stages, etc. And what you need to concentrate on when it comes to actually getting ready to launch your podcast. There's a few things that you need to really be doing to make it as effective a podcast launch as possible, which makes it a bit easier down the road to start attracting the kind of listeners and then further down the road, possibly sponsors and partners that you're looking to bring onto your podcast. After that, we'll look at the pre-launch. So now you've got all your pre-planning out and you pre-published stuff out. At the pre-launch, there's a few things again that you want to be looking at and just making sure that you've got them in place, ready to go for the launch. And that could be stuff like, okay, who am I distributing my podcast to? Am I going to have any podcast feed swaps with other podcasters, any guest posts, anything like that? So we'll cover the pre-launch checklist as well. And then post-launch, now that you've got your podcast out, you've got your first episode or your first trailer, or even your first episodes, if you're releasing 2, 3, 4 episodes all at once when you launch your podcast, we'll look at what you want to do post-launch to actually get your podcast, start and grow, getting your first listeners, getting your marketing ducks in a row, if you like, and all the good stuff that you need for that. So it's a nice, simple 3-stage process, and we're just purely concentrating on launching your podcast today. There's a lot of good stuff that we've got over at Captivate FM on our blog when it comes to growing and marketing your podcast, and a lot of the tools that we have within the Captivate dashboard. But this one is purely about launching your podcast and any questions you might have when it comes to launching. How does the artwork work? How does distribution work, etc. So like I say, we've got like 3 phases. We'll probably look at that for the next 20-25 minutes or so. And then after we've gone through these 3 phases, we can jump back on. We'll come back over ready for the Q&A session. And again, if you've got any questions or anything, by all means, drop them into the comments at the side of the little video. So probably I'm thinking where the screen is now, probably down here somewhere. Just drop your questions in there and put question at the front. And as I say, my colleague Ben will pop that up for you. So I'm just going to bring up my screen share now. So if you see me looking over to this side, I've just got a little second screen here that has got my little live stream details here. So I can see any of the comments coming in or any of the questions coming in that Ben will pick up. But also I can see what we're going to be sharing over here. So just a little second screen. I'll look over here now again, but I'll be focusing on this side. So let me just bring up the share screen for you. So we've got some people joining already, so that's kind of cool. And as I mentioned, at the end of the live webinar, as we're going through the Q&A, we'll drop a link in where you can grab the resource that we're going to show you today to help you launch the podcast. So let's just bring up my screen now. We want this one and share. And let's go to, here we go. Okay, so you should be seeing that now, which is the Podcast Launch Accelerator crib sheet. And this is a free resource that we've put together for all podcasters that are looking to launch their podcast. So this will take you through, as I mentioned, it will take you through the pre-publish stage, the pre-launch stage, and post-launch. And some of the stuff that you really want to knuckle down and lock in when it comes to helping you successfully launch your podcast. And this goes for any podcast. It could be your very first one. It could be your second, third, even your 10th podcast down the road. Even, experienced podcasters can always learn something new. I know I can always learn something new when it comes to launching a new show and getting new listeners and a new audience. So this will really help you walk through what these are. So as you can see on here, we've got the launch your podcast, attract your first 100 listeners, and cover your costs in just 28 days. And this really comes into play. A lot of people talk about monetizing podcasts and making revenue from podcasts. And there's lots of ways to do that. And we have a lot of ways at Captivate to help you monetize your podcast. But one of the early goals could just be making sure that you've got enough to cover your podcast host fees. And that way you don't ever have to worry about your podcast and hosting. You just need to concentrate on getting your episodes and your podcast out there and growing your listeners that way. So a couple of things that we bring up right out the door is you want to have a firm date on a firm goal on when you're launching your podcast. Now, you could be in the planning stage now. You could be about to launch it next week. But anytime you're going to be releasing a new podcast, just have an idea and a really good solid goal. Okay, here's when I'm going to launch it, because then you can start to track back and work back on what you have to do to make that a successful launch. So we're at near the end of February now, I believe. So let's say you're going to launch your podcast at the end of March or the end of April, ready for a big summer push when it comes to marketing, etc. So just put down here, I'm going to launch it on March 30th. I'm going to launch on April 30th, whatever your date might be. And that gives you almost like a little fridge magnet, if you like. You can print this resource off, but also it gives you almost like a little fridge magnet where you've got a physical file and a physical reminder that, hey, I'm going to launch my podcast on such and such a date. So super excited. I'm going to get lots of promo behind it. I'm going to reach out to lots of other podcasters, my own connections, friends, families even, and let them know when I'm launching so they can help me share with their friends and their connections and their online resources. So once you've got your podcast date on, as I mentioned, that will really help you understand what you need to do to make that date a successful launch. So to get there, one of the things that you want to understand is obviously what your podcast is going to be about. And it's, there's nothing wrong with just launching a podcast, getting it out there and being a couple of friends that are just sitting down, a couple of beers around the fire in the summer, just talking about anything and anything that interests you. Could be your favorite movies, favorite books, favorite sports team. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to really launch your podcast successfully and grow your listeners and grow an audience after that, it's always good to really understand what your podcast is going to be about and who it's going to be for. So you want to understand, is it a hobby? Is it something that you're just going to do for fun and you're never going to be bothered about how many listeners you get or how many partners and sponsors you might get? So if it's a hobby podcast, that's awesome. And then you just need to plan out what's it going to look like, how's it going to sound, or what's it going to talk about, etc. Is it for your business? So a lot of businesses now, obviously, and it could be for your own business, have a podcast as another lead generation and content generation platform and tool. So if this is going to be for your podcast and what your podcast, is going to be about, then if it's for your business, what's the goals there? And it's the same is my podcast for my employer. What's the goals? Is it to bring new employees to your business? Is it to bring new business to your company? Is it to position yourself as a brand leader or a leader in the industry space that you're in through ideas and guests and topics that you discussed in your podcast? So this gives you an idea as to what your podcast is going to be about, because once you understand who the podcast is for, then it makes it really easy to understand, okay, so now what does the audience for that podcast look like, and what do they enjoy? What would they like to hear about? And you can get stuff like this from a whole bunch of places. So obviously online, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, anywhere that you have a social presence. You might also have like a sort of contact or a Q&A form on your website as acting as a lead generation, and potential customers or potential leads come through there, and they'll show you they'll share their pain points and what they're looking for from your business or the services that you offer. So this gives you, again, a good idea what your audience is looking for and the stuff that they like. Your Google Analytics, if you have that installed in your website, that will show you who your visitors are, their behaviors, their interests, what kind of industries they're involved in, etc. So you've got a lot of places that you can get information from, which will really help you understand who is your ideal audience for your new podcast. So once you've started to understand, this is what I'm going to talk about, and this is who I'm making it for, it then helps you to understand, well, I'm going up against other podcasts in my space. What do they look like? How do they promote, and how do they market the shows? What's their audience look like? Can I attract some of their audience? So you want to start looking at, when you're positioning your podcast, because there's like a lot of podcasts in the on the market at the moment. There's anywhere between 2 million and 4 million, depending on what numbers you look at and what reports you look at. So there's a lot of podcasts out there. So what you want to make sure is, when you're launching your podcast, you have a good idea what you're going to be offering, who your audience is going to be, and that will allow you to try find a niche for that podcast in a very busy industry. So if you're talking about, let's say you're in a manufacturing business, but you manufacture a very specific kind of hydraulic nut or bolt, very niche. So you've got an ideal audience there. So again, you can look at, here's what my manufacturing podcast is going to talk about, but it's going to talk with a very specific audience and a very specific industry niche. And again, that will help you go after a low competition space that will, again, help your podcast launch successfully. So you get these three little dynamics going together: what your podcast is about, who it's going to be for, and how you're going to insert it into the niche, if you like. So once you've got that information, you want to be looking at designing your podcast. And this comes into play with a lot of different things. So one of the things are, going back to who it's for, what are you creating the podcast for? Is it to build your own network, either online, or to bring people in as, for your consultancy or for your business or for your craft hobby, etc.? Are you going to be selling things to your audience? So are you going to be using your podcast as a resource to sell an online course, to sell a Patreon, donation area, to sell anything that you have online from an e-commerce point of view? And how's that going to work? Will you be using calls to action from your podcast to drive people back to your website? Or is it to sell sponsorship and listener support? So again, I mentioned Patreon earlier, but do you want to work with sponsors and partners in the area that your podcast is about? So if you're, let's say you're an audio musician, can you partner with guitar manufacturers or pick manufacturers or drum manufacturers or even audiobooks, not audiobooks, but music books, printers, for example, and authors. So look at potential partners in your space and who you can, partner with down the line. It's never too early to start reaching out for potential sponsors and partners, even in the pre-launch stage, because that's building up a sort of relationship for further down the line when they're ready to come on and work with you, because you've got a very engaged audience. You've nurtured this audience very carefully by delivering, consistently and quality content through your podcast. So with your audience being trusting you now, ready to work with a partner that makes sense for you, your show, and your audience. So again, think of why you're creating a podcast and what you want to achieve from it. And then, is it going to be a solo podcast, or is it going to be an interview podcast, or is it going to be co-hosted? There's a whole variety of different shows out there, and all successful in their own niches. And it's really down to you what you want to do and how you want to present the podcast. A lot of podcasters prefer a co-host because it takes the pressure off a little bit, and you can always pass the buck, if you like, to someone else asking the questions or talking about the topic that your podcast is about. Interview podcasts are always popular because, again, it brings people onto your show that can then help grow your show because of them being able to share with their audience once your episode is published with that particular guest. So just kind of work out, what kind of show you want to look and present. And then what's your ideal listener avatar? Now, this really goes back to the sort of details that we talked about earlier regarding your audience, and you can get that from your Google Analytics, from social media analytics, like Twitter has analytics for your tweets, etc., that shows you details about your audience. And what does your ideal listener avatar look like? So, is it 25 to 35-year-old male, females that enjoy holidays, for example, for a holidays type podcast? Once you can start to build out what your avatar looks like, it makes it really simple for you now to meet the interests that they would enjoy from a podcast with the topics of your podcast episodes. And that helps you plan ahead for your content calendar getting further down the line after your podcast is launched to start planning out, am I going to do seasonal episodes? Am I going to do topical episodes about news events and stuff like that? And it really helps you understand how you're going to actually serve your listener avatar with the kind of content that you're going to bring out on the podcast. Now, obviously, you want your show name. Doesn't every podcast needs a show name? Now, this can be something that ties into you yourself or your business stroke brand, or it can be tied into the kind of show that it is or the topic that it's talking about. It's always good to try keep your podcast name short and relatively punchy for a couple of reasons. It's always easier to remember. So if you're sharing your show on your podcast or someone else's podcast because you're a guest or you're doing a feed drop or something, the shorter the show title is, the easier it is to remember and mention on your podcast. And if I'm listening to the podcast back on my headphones or in the car or wherever I am listening to podcasts that day, I can remember a short name better than I can remember a longer name. Now, that could just be me, but a nice short punchy name is always a good way to go. And your show tagline. This really speaks to your potential audience and listeners on what to expect from your show. So if your show is something like UK soccer teams 1990s, so that's a very specific niche for UK soccer teams in that period, then your tagline is the best soccer teams from the UK in a decade that ruled the world. Now that's like a kind of winding tagline there, but it gives you an idea where you're trying to give more information about your episode and your podcast, and that anybody scrolling on a podcast app or anything, for the apps that support the taglines, will be able to see this tagline right away and know, this is what the podcast and episode is all about. And then choose a publish time. One of the areas that a lot of podcasters slip up initially when launching is publishing at different days and times. And I completely understand if this is, everybody's calendar is different. Everybody's got so much to do during the day and it can be difficult to, set up a consistent time. But your listeners will react more and follow more if you can set down a consistent time for your podcast. Now, this could be Monday mornings at 7 a.m. ready for people to, commute to work if they still commute now, well, with the new working rules that we kind of have in place at the moment. But if you can set out a day and a time and consistently stick to that, and it can be weekly, bi-weekly, some podcasters do actually do it monthly. So work out what looks a good schedule for you that's realistic for you to meet, and then stick to that. And then as your podcast grows more episodes, your listeners will know now that, okay, on Tuesday evening at 8 p.m, I know that Jane's podcast is going to launch and I'll be able to listen to it while I'm relaxing after my work or whatever. With the consistency, people will know when to expect it. It's like your favorite TV show. You always know what day of the week it's on and what channel and what time, etc. Podcasting is no different. If you can build that consistency, it will help your listeners be ready for your show. Another thing that you want to do is think of your show notables and calls to action. Now, notables are really what helps you stand out. So what's notable about your show? Well, I may, for example, have an in to my local radio station, and they will give me their presenters and their special guests, etc., as bonus content for my podcast. Now, that's one example. But if you know that there's something that will really help your podcast stand out and is notable for listeners, then highlight that and make that stand out, so you know that anytime you want to bring a call to action on your podcast episode, one of the things for the listeners is, hey, this is the place that you'll always get X, Y, Z. And your calls to action can be at any time in your episode. Now you can see that we've got pre-roll, which is before your episode, mid-roll, which is during your episode in content, and then post-roll at the end of your episode after it. And pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll is just a matter of inserting a special additional piece of content that shares a call to action, which is something that you want your listener to do after they listen to the episode. So it could be simply follow the podcast on your favorite podcast app. It could be go to domain.com/email to sign up for a newsletter, or domain.com/store or shop to check out my online store, e-commerce store, etc. So think of what your calls to action are that you want to share with your listeners, and then also think about how many calls to action you use, because you don't want too many in an episode depending on the episode length. So if your episode is 30 minutes, you may only want a pre-roll and a post-roll. If it's longer, then you want to start maybe looking at mid-rolls where you can position your call to action at different points of the episode, and your episode will pause while this mid-roll announcement comes in for the listener. So think of the ones that you want to really concentrate on, and then use that as your calls to action based on where you want them in your episode, pre, mid, and post. And the great thing is you can always change them with dynamic content. At Captivate FM, for example, we have a solution called Amy, which is our dynamic content and audio monetization platform. And that allows you to go through your whole catalog and update any pre-roll ads or sponsor messages, or even your own content messages. Same with mid-roll and post-roll, and change them anytime. So you can change a dynamic piece of content based on seasonal messages, based on topical messages, etc. So that's the great thing with dynamic content. You can change this at any time and always keep your episodes relevant and timely for the message you want to share. The other thing you want to be looking at is audio assets. So intro music, outro music, do you have an introduction to your podcast, all that kind of stuff. And if you do, are you going to do the intro yourself, or are you going to use an outsourced lab, like Fiverr or Music Radio Creative, which is a lot of jingles and productions for podcasters? And the same with your music. Do you want to get that from an outsourced place, or do you have the ability to do it yourself? If you have the ability to do it yourself, sometimes it can help podcast listeners get ready for your episode if they're recognizing your voice, as the pre-roll, etc., as the introduction. But a lot of people prefer getting someone else to do it. So again, purely your choice. And this comes down to outro music as well. If you want to do it yourself, or if you want to outsource it for someone else to do. Then you want to look at the episode flow. So we've got segments here, you can see on the left-hand side there. And what's that going to look like? So it's segment 1, information about your guest, for example, or a segment 1, how to follow your podcast. And then segment 2, guest, segment 3, here's the topics we want to talk about, segment 4, and so on. So work out what your segments are going to look like, and that'll help you get into a really nice flow for every single episode. And your listeners will also start to understand, hey, this is what I can expect from, Jane or Joe's podcast. I know that I'm going to find out what's going to be awesome in this week's episode, and then settle down for the episode itself. So I'll look at some of the segments and what that's going to look like, and it just helps you get really used to what the episode is going to do and how it's going to, sound when it comes out. Your podcast cover art is really important. That's one of the first things that any new listener will potentially see when they're scrolling on their phone on their favorite podcast app, or checking out Apple Podcast previews, etc. So a nice, really strong visual and bold podcast cover art is super key and super important to help your little square pop out when people are scrolling on the preferred podcast app. Now, there's some specifications that you need to sort of stick to, and this is based on Apple podcast specifications, and they're very strict, if you like, on even if your artwork is off by one tiny little pixel, they won't really accept it. So the general flow is to go minimum 1400px by 1400px, maximum 3000px by 3000px. That's just pixel size. Make sure it's a square image. You want to make sure it's a JPEG or PNG image, and it's under 500/512 kilobytes in size. Now, the good news is, that sounds like a lot of technical information, but the good news is it's fairly straightforward. You just have to, make sure that it follows that little specifications. And a tool like canva.com, for example, they have an awesome range of about 30, 50, maybe even more podcast artwork templates. And you can basically go and create your free Canva account, use one of the templates, but then adapt it to your own artwork and upload your own images, etc. And then use that template to then put together your own artwork to cover. It's awesome. It takes away a lot of the guesswork around the actual specifications and size. You can also go to Fiverr or 99 Designs. 99 Designs is pretty cool. They'll put a bunch of designers on your project, and then you pick the best one, and that's the one that you pay for. You don't worry about anybody else's artwork that came through. You just choose the one that you like. And just think about other podcast cover arts that you really like and why you like them. And that can help you make a decision what your artwork would be looking like. Is it their fonts? Is it the colors? Is it the fact that they've got themselves front and center? Just compare 2 or 3, maybe 4 different artworks from other podcasters, and then use that as a guide to help yourself position your own artwork. Your podcast description, super important. Again, this is what people are going to read and make a decision based on your show name, your tagline, your artwork, etc. Everything ties together when it comes to whether someone's going to listen to your podcast or potential listen to it. So podcast description, it's up to 4,000 characters, and it basically allows you to, update everyone what your podcast is about. So this is my podcast, this is what it's about, this is the frequency, this is what you can expect, here's how you can follow it, here's where you can connect online, that kind of stuff. Make it as descriptive as possible, because this is your elevator pitch, if you like, on potential listeners checking out your podcast based on the description. And in your categories, some podcast apps only allow for 1, but we at Captivate, we let you select 3 categories, because Apple has 3 categories, Spotify has 3 categories, but they also have a lot of subcategories, which Apple Podcast does as well. So choosing your categories and subcategories can really help you when it comes to placing your podcast in the right category on these apps for people to find you. So this is a really good exercise to sit down and really knuckle down what your category is. Is it lifestyle? And if it's lifestyle, what's the subcategory of that? Is it parenting? If it's parenting, what's the subcategory? Is it kids? Is it health? Is it education? So think of the subcategories as well. The cool thing with the subcategories is now you're essentially getting double the amount of search placements or category placements on Apple Podcasts, because if it's parents and stroke education, you'll appear in both the parents and the education subcategory, depending on the display on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. So it's a nice little trick to sort of look at the different categories to help you with more search placements and more category placements. You can see we've put together a really simple episode show notes template. And again, this will really help you just lock down what every episode show notes will look like. Think of show notes as a blog post for a podcast, and it gives you an introduction to the episode. If you've got a guest, who the guest is, and what they're about and where you can find them. And then if you want to link any timestamps to certain points in the episode that listeners can jump forward to, because that's what they want to listen to most, you can do that with the timestamps. Have little takeaways in a bullet form, and that'll allow you to listeners scan and just have a look what interests them and say, yeah, this episode is going to really be something I'm interested in, take away stuff from. And then anything like links outwards to your guest bio, your guest website, where people connect with you online, etc. And then a teaser paragraph of the next episode. If you're planning ahead and you know what your next episodes are going to be like, a little teaser is always nice to say in next week's episode or next time, we'll be talking about X, Y, Z. And again, it's just getting your listener primed for your next episode and building up that followership. The next part of podcasting and launching your podcast is the technology, and this is something that sometimes we can get very bogged down on, and there's no need to, because I think a lot of times we see a lot of people online talking about, wow, you have to have this mic, you have to have this mixing desk, you have to have these headphones, you have to have X, Y, Z to launch your podcast. You don't need all the top gear. If you can get good headphones and a good microphone that plugs into your computer, you're ready to go. So think of what your budget's like, and think of what's more important to you to get the podcast launched. Now, a lot of the times you do want obviously good sound quality, which comes in with editing and equipment and how you use a mic, etc. But you can learn that. What you want to do first is make sure you've got the equipment that's right for your budget and the right for your needs at that time. So it could be for the microphones, for example. If you're in an office or a room in your home and that's where you're going to record your podcast and it's got a lot of hard surfaces, you don't want a microphone that's going to pick all that echo and all that, that hard surfaces up. So a dynamic microphone like the ATR 2100 or the Samsung Q2U, for example, are great microphones and great inexpensive microphones that plug straight into your computer, and then you can record directly onto your laptop or your computer based on what you've got installed on that. So for MacBook, it would be GarageBand, for example. For a PC or laptop, you might download something like Audacity or have something different on that. And then you look at your recording choice. How are you going to record? So if you're a one-person podcast, are you just going to record it directly at home, straight into your computer, ready to upload? That's great. That's where you would use GarageBand or Audacity or whatever else you want to use. Are you going to have remote guests on? In which case, you need to use like a Squadcast or a Boomcaster to have guests on coming, that you can connect with online, similar to Zoom, where you can have the camera and you can have the questions and everything like a standard interview, ready to download the files from your chosen app and then upload, ready to publish on your podcast host of choice. And then your editing software. And again, editing really comes down to some podcasters like to just do the podcast as it is and then upload it straight away to the podcast host, and that's fine. But as you want to grow your audience and really start to expand your audience and potential partnerships and stuff, if you can do even the most basic of editing that removes some filler words and balances the sound out between two different speakers, etc., your listeners will really thank you for that. And it's a great way to understand more about the back end of podcasting that will help you for future podcasts. Sorry, little cup of tea there. So again, choose your editing choice of software and then who you're going to use for podcast hosting. And as I mentioned, obviously, we'd love it to be Captivate FM. We make it super easy for you to get launched, distribute your show, and then manage it afterwards and track all the success, etc. But whoever your podcast host is going to be, choose what it is based on your budget and your goals for your actual show. Now, the phase 3 part, this is like the post-launch, if you like. And this is where you sort of get ready, before you start recording, etc. This is how you start to build your podcast up. So look at your trailer. Some podcasters don't use trailers, and that's perfectly fine. But the great thing with a trailer, think of your favorite movie. Did you go to see that because word of mouth only, or was it because a trailer made it look really kick-ass and you wanted to go see this movie as soon as it was released? So think of your podcast trailer along the same lines, where it's an opportunity for you to upload a quick 60-90 second, maybe 2-minute audio file or an audio trailer that really lets your potential listeners know what to expect if they decide to listen to your podcast. So think of, this is what it's about. This is what you can expect. These are the days it will be dropping. These are the kind of guests you can expect, and this is where you can find it. And if you can publish that trailer, there's 2 bonuses to that. So one of them is, as I mentioned, it really helps potential listeners decide, hey, this podcast sounds pretty cool. I'm going to look out for it when it launches. Because you may launch a trailer, say, 2 weeks before your main podcast actually goes live to build up that excitement. You can also launch a trailer at the same time as your first or second or third episode. It's entirely up to you. But if you're launching it beforehand, as I mentioned, it's a good way to really let you build up the interest and excitement for your podcast. But the second benefit of launching a trailer before your show, when you first launch a podcast, you need to submit it to Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, etc. to get approved on their podcast apps, ready for listeners to choose the app of preference and follow your podcast. Depending on which app you go through and the distribution time and how long they take to approve it, it can take anywhere from a few hours. Some podcast apps are really quick at getting your podcast launched immediately. Some can take a bit longer. Google Podcast takes anywhere up to a week at times. So if you're telling people that your podcast is going to launch at the end of March, then you've got to keep that in mind that, hey, it could take a week for me to actually get my podcast out there. Maybe I should launch my trailer the week before. So now you're doing a soft launch, but you've got your podcast approved and your show approved, ready for the new episodes to go out as soon as you publish episode 1, 2, 3 onwards. So it's great to do a trailer ready for that. Then look at the pre-recording checklist. So this is for both you and your guests. So make sure all the cables are set up that you need between your computer and your recording software. Make sure you've got your mics. I've done this so many times. Make sure you got your mic switched on. Always helps if you actually want to, capture what you're saying at the time. Reduce any noise that you have around about your environment. So if it's a summer and you live on a busy street, make sure your windows closed in your office, for example, so there's no traffic going by or kids playing in the backyard, etc. Switch off any distractions. So make sure your cell phone switched to airplane mode or switched off or at least on mute as a bare minimum. And then just do a quick pre-check and then hit record. And the same with your guests. Make sure that if you're bringing guests on that aren't in the podcasting space or aren't really familiar with the tech and the setup, etc., help them be prepared for your recording. So one of the things I do is I'm fairly fortunate that my guests are all podcasters or pretty much in the podcasting tech space. So they've got a good grip on what to do when they come on for recording an episode. But I know a lot of friends and colleagues have guests that are more about authors, for example, or musicians that may not be in the space, so may not be aware of this is how remote recording works, this is how echo cancellation works, etc. So make it easy for your guests to come on and just be themselves. So what I do is I'll send a cheat sheet out and it has a breakdown of this is the platform I use, this is what to expect, here's what to look for on the screen, and this is to get the best experience, have a separate mic and headphones if possible. If not, these are the alternatives. And always make it clear up front what's going to be the best experience for your guests, because at the end of the day, they're giving you their time. If you look after them, they'll be more appreciative of that and more likely to share the episode afterwards once it's published. So look after your guests and make it super easy for them to come on your podcast. Once you've got your trailer ready, as mentioned, it's time to start submitting to the various apps. And at Captivate, we make it super easy. We've got like a one-click distribution section, and it's the majority of the podcast apps are automated. So you just hit the one click, and that's it. It goes out. And as I mentioned, a lot of them, because we support the PodPing tag, a lot of them goes out and gets published pretty quickly. But whatever your podcast host is, it's fairly straightforward getting distributed. Just make sure that you've got your episode ready to go, you've chosen all the right categories, etc., and then hit distribute. There are some manual ones you can do that can be further down the line after you've got your trailer set up, and then you can start to look at, okay, I need to add my podcast to TuneIn or Pandora or Deezer or iHeartRadio or anywhere like that where there might be a more manual process. There's a great resource over at PodNews. Just type in podnews.net, which is like a great industry publication. Just type in distribution, and they've got a page on the website that shows you all the apps that you can distribute to and how to do it. Really good resource. So once your trailer's set off, you'll be notified by the apps that will notify you. So Apple will tell you, Spotify will tell you, Google Podcasts will tell you, Amazon will tell you, etc., that your podcast is now live and here's the live link. And then that's great because now you can start using these links to build up your listening page. Here's how you can find my podcast on these various apps. And again, Captivate will make it super easy. We've got a single promo link. So you just put all your links in there and we'll show the icons for the various apps where people can follow your podcast. And then that's it. You've distributed it. You've got it ready for approval. You've got it now approved. They're all on the apps. And now it's just a matter of launching the podcast. So once you've done that, once your trailer is set out to the distribution channels and you've got your podcast ready to go in lieu of your episode 1, 2, 3, let's start prepping this podcast launch. So now you can see we've got a pre-launch and a launch week checklist here. And some of the things that you can do there is who are you going to ask to help you share the podcast? Friends and family are some of the best resources when it comes to telling people about your podcast and the fact that you've got a new podcast, because they want to see you succeed. At least I hope I hope they do. There might be some friends that may not, who knows, maybe choose new friends. But friends and family are awesome. Work colleagues, people in your immediate connection, in your immediate circle are really good at helping tell their friends and their colleagues, etc. Hey, my brother, my son, etc. has got a new podcast. I know you like XYZ. You might want to check it out. You might want to do some PR outreach. So you might want to reach out to publications, as I mentioned, like PodNews, for example, to say you've got a new podcast. They take submissions, and often they will share new podcasts as long as it's relevant, and you make a good pitch. Look at various online groups that you can join, and they can help you, get tips on launching a podcast. but they may also want to share your podcast with their connections. So there's a whole bunch of ways that you can do pre-launch, ready to sort of build up the interest for your podcast once it's launched. Then on the launch stage, on launch week, there's a little bit different ones. So again, let's do a thank you episode, for example, where you thank the people that's helped you, like the guests, the people that's helped you get to where you are now. Maybe do a live stream to say, hey, my podcast is now launched and I'm super excited. Have you got any questions? What would you like to see in episodes, etc., coming down the line? Have you submitted it to any other, industry publications or newsletters? There's a lot of great podcast newsletters out there. I mentioned Pod News. Ariel Nissenblatt's got a great one called Earbuds Collective. There's Pod Insights. There's so many podcast newsletters out there. Go on Twitter, just do a search for podcast newsletters, and you'll see, a bunch of people pop up. But look to connect with the editors of these podcast newsletters and build relationships there. And they're always looking for good submissions that might tie in. For example, Ariel's newsletter, where it's she'll bring every week, it'll be 5 different podcasts in a niche, and it may be your podcast fits within that niche. So that's a good way to to reach out and connect with Ariel. So look at ways that you can sort of build up the pre-promotion and then the launch week promotion by having industry contacts and online connections, etc. And then make yourself available as well. It might be that people want to talk to you about your podcast launch. So are you available to go on a podcast and talk about it and be a guest on that podcast, or do a live stream on someone's Facebook group or a Twitter space or even in a Twitter community, etc.? Sort of look out for opportunities you can do there that will really help you, go from, okay, now I've launched it. Now I'm ready to start growing it and go for these first 100 listeners that we spoke about and start to build your followers and, monetization options, etc. down the line. We've put a list together, and I'm going to share the link to this soon. We put a list together for you on resources that you can use and need. And this comes down to, based on, is it email marketing? Is it editing software? Some equipment that you want to use, etc. So again, this is a whole free resource that we'll be sharing for you that you can use to really get the equipment, get the tools, get the expertise, etc., and get the backup and the resources that you need ready to launch your podcast. And that's it. I mean, you've got your podcast launched. Your notes is really about, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what can I do to change that? Now that my podcast is launched, how can I actually get that, starting to grow, etc. So use this area as a little sort of tip section for your own sort of internal debrief, if you like, on, okay, I launched my podcast, but I forgot to promote the trailer, so nobody knew about it. Little things like that you can help you, A, with this podcast, and B, moving forward, if you really get the podcasting bug and you want podcast 2, podcast 3, podcast 4, etc. We've also got a great Facebook group if you want to join us. We're over at facebook.com/groups/podcast tips. And that's a free group to join. And there's a bunch of podcasters in there sharing tips and resources about launching a podcast. And we're always there from the Captivate team to help you. And you can also go to podcastsuccessacademy.com, which gives you a lot of free online resources and tips, and just a great resource to help you with that. Now, let me just bring this up for you. So the link that you want to be going to for the free crib sheet, I'm just going to bring that up now. There we go. Okay, so you can see if you go to captivate.fm/crib sheet, that will give you this document that we've just gone through today, and it'll allow you to download that, start planning out your podcast launch and making sure that you're ready to go for the launch. And it really is a great resource to help you make sure that you tick off all the relevant pieces and all the right stuff that you will need to help your own podcast, your own podcast launch successfully, ready to distribute it, to make sure you've got the right host based on your needs, to make sure you're tracking exactly how effective your trailer was, how the analytics are looking for episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And it's just a really awesome resource. I've used it tons of times to launch different podcasts, throughout the last 2.5, 3 years maybe. It really is an awesome resource. So go to captivate.fm/crib sheet, and that will really help you, launch your podcast successfully. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there. I should be back on now, which is kind of cool. So let me just bring this over. So that's it. So that's awesome. So hopefully this webinar has helped you understand a little bit of behind the scenes as to what you're going to be looking at when it comes to launching your podcast and some of the stuff that you want, when it comes to actually launching it successfully. So if there's any questions, we're going to be around for the next 10, maybe 15 minutes, depending on if there are any questions you have. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I can see the comments coming in now. And any questions you have about the crib sheet, anything that we went over on the webinar, or about the tool, software, etc. that you have when it comes to launching it, we'll be around for a little bit to do that. And as I mentioned, obviously, we're from Captivate. We'd love you to join us, but this is all about you launching your podcast. So it doesn't matter which host you're on, or if you're even self-hosting. A lot of podcasters now like to self-host, for example. But it's just whatever your preference is, we can answer that for you, not a problem. And a cool thing, if you're not on Captivate, we just launched actually. We mentioned show notes earlier, that we have a template for show notes to help you make the most of your actual episode show notes. We just launched the Dynamic Show Notes Builder, which is a really cool feature, and that helps automate a lot of the show notes for you. So if you have something that's going to appear in every episode, for example, so it could be your intro blurb, it could be the fact that this is where you can find me, it could be your guest information or your sponsor information that may change based on season, etc. The Dynamic Show Notes Builder will help you, insert that every time on every single episode, including your back episodes, once you go in and just update the fact that there's now dynamic notes there, and that will really help you make your edit time a lot quicker, creating your show notes a lot quicker, and that's another great resource that will help you make your podcasting a lot more fun and a lot more smoother. So if show notes is something that you're not quite sure about, again, we've got the awesome Dynamic Show Notes Builder. Okay, so as I mentioned at the bottom, we've got start again, shall I? We've got captivate.fm/cribsheet. So if you want to download, it's a 26-page PDF. It's free for everyone. You can download that, and I'll go through all the details that we went through today in this webinar. That has, the checklist for pre-launch, pre-publish, post-launch, and really make sure that you've got everything ready to get yourself on a successful podcast launch. Alrighty, so I think that's going to be us today, actually. Thanks for joining. We do this once a month where we'll talk about launching your podcast and making sure that you've got everything you need to successfully launch your podcast. So if you didn't, manage to catch up everything this time, we're on once a month, and we'll always drop that in our Facebook group that I mentioned earlier, as well as the Captivate newsletter that I know a lot of you signed up for. And then follow us online at Captivate Audio on Twitter and at Danny Brown CA on Twitter. If you have any questions about A, Captivate, or B, launching a podcast, myself and the Captivate team, we're always happy to answer these for you. So, check us out over on Twitter, always happy. And if you want to check out Captivate yourself, go to captivate.fm and then just check out all the features we have. Like I said, we make it super easy for all podcasters, from new podcasters, experienced podcasters, to A, launch and distribute a podcast, and B, market and grow and monetize your podcast. Got a whole bunch of tools that we offer to every podcaster on our plans. We don't hide anything behind premium upgrades or anything. So if you want deep dive analytics, or you want attribution links, or you want email marketing, etc., it's all included in every plan, from personal up to the business. So if you want to check it out, we're always happy to see you over there. And myself, Ben from the team, Lester, Judy, everyone over there, super friendly, and we'll always be there in the live chat to help you out there. So again, thanks for joining the webinar today. I hope you got a lot of good information regarding launching it and what needs to be done to effectively and successfully launch it. And as mentioned, we do this every month. So if you missed anything this time, we'll be here, same place, same channel, in a month's time. So until then, have a great rest of the week. It's Wednesday afternoon, or evening maybe where you are, morning potentially. Have a great rest of the week and upcoming weekend, and stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.